Okay, let's dive in. There's this unsettling idea floating around, suggested by our sources today. What if talk about regulating social media isn't really about rules, but more like, well, censorship?
Exactly. And how power struggles might be playing out right in front of us, maybe even behind the scenes.
That's really the core of what we're looking at today, using sources focused on recent events in Brazil.
Uh-huh. We've got analyses, transcripts, summaries, all pointing towards these fears around social media regulation, plus the really complicated testimony of Maro Cid.
So, our mission for this deep dive,
Basically to cut through the noise.
yeah, to pull out the key insights from this material, what's actually being said about free expression, about power, according to these sources.
What are the main things you need to grasp to be well informed on this based on what we've reviewed?
Let's start there with that word regulation. The sources paint a picture of deep suspicion around it.
Right. The fear, quite clearly articulated, is that this push for new rules is, well, a disguise.
A disguise for censorship, aimed at specific political views.
That's the argument presented. And the sources show this fear isn't just being whispered, it's out there in satire, too.
Like that Andre Good's animation. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it's described as very direct. You have this character, Xandão, who represents Justice Alexandre de Moraes.
Okay.
And he's telling these minion-type figures to regulate the internet.
And they immediately jump to
Censor everyone. That's the instant reaction in the animation. Xandão then corrects them, saying, no, regulate everyone.
the subtle difference?
Yeah, exactly. They're told to ban fake news. And the animation then shows them targeting critics of Lula, Elkman, judges, even podcasters.
So very specific targets.
Yes, and the satire, as the sources point out, highlights this perceived selective application, like someone seen as aligned with the powerful, maybe suggesting new taxes, they're left alone.
And the punchline.
It's quite something. The regulators end up banning Xandão himself.
Huh. So what's the takeaway message there?
It leads to this line highlighted in the sources, referencing a famous poem. So the poet was right. It's not about what is being said, but about who says it.
That captures the criticism perfectly. It's about who is speaking, not just what they're saying.
That's the perspective being conveyed. And there's another piece of satire mentioned, the Daniela Lima parody.
Right. What was that about?
It's presented as a critique of a particular journalist. The parody portrays her as almost hungry for leaks or instructions about censorship.
Using phrases like,
Things like her work might drip with partiality, and lines such as, "Give me this scoop, minister, send more censorship."
wow, okay. So the sources use this to suggest.
A perception, at least, of media bias or even complicity in efforts to control the narrative.
So the satire reflects the sort of public, maybe emotional response. But these fears are also grounded in more formal arguments, right? Legal and political ones.
Absolutely. The sources analyze, for instance, a Canal Livre interview with a senator.
And he's arguing against these broad new regulations.
Strongly. His core point, as reported, is that Brazil already has the laws it needs.
Like the Marco Civil da Internet.
Exactly. That and existing defamation laws. He argues they're perfectly adequate for dealing with things like libel online. He pushes back quite firmly against the idea that there's some kind of legal void needing brand new rules.
And he raises concerns about the judiciary stepping out of line.
Yes, that's a major theme. Judicial overreach. He contends the Supreme Court is trying to legislate, basically.
Which, he argues, should be Congress's job alone.
Precisely. He frames it as judicial activism. He even draws a contrast, between the U.S. First Amendment approach, broad protection, and European models, which were often more restrictive due to historical context.
His big fear seems to be prior censorship, stopping speech before it happens.
That's the crux of it. And the sources also bring in Boris Casoy, who seems even more direct.
What does he say?
Well, he's presented as stating very plainly that the STF's actions, especially around Article 19 of the Marco Civil...
That's the one about platform liability.
Right. He says the STF's moves regarding that article are censorship. Full stop.
So he doubles down on the idea that the court is legislating, not just interpreting.
Yes. And the sources also note he pointed out a kind of irony, contrasting Lula's past criticism of media control elsewhere with the current situation these critics are describing in Brazil.
Okay, so if we pull this first part together, the sources are suggesting that for critics, regulation has become a loaded term.
Definitely. Viewed less as neutral management and more as a tool to control narratives and silence certain voices.
And the feeling is the existing legal tools are sufficient, so this new push must be about something else. power, basically.
That's the strong undercurrent in the material discussing regulation. But then how does this relate to other areas where power and narratives are clashing?
Which brings us to the second set of sources, focusing on Mauro Cid's testimony.
Yeah, this gives us a different, maybe more granular look at these power dynamics.
So Cid, Bolsonaro's former aide, he was questioned directly by Justice Moraes about those leaked audios.
Correct. Audios where Cid seemed to suggest he'd been pressured by the federal police and the STF in his plea deal testimony.
That sounds like a high-stakes confrontation. The judge asking the witness about pressure from the judge's own institution?
Extremely high stakes. And the sources report that in the formal hearing, Cid officially denied being coerced during his depositions. He stated his lawyers were always there.
Okay, the formal denial. But then what about the leaked audio itself? How did he explain that?
Right, he had to account for it. He described those conversations as informal vents, desabafos in Portuguese.
Just letting off steam.
Essentially, he painted a picture of being under immense personal and psychological strain at the time.
The sources mentioned his family, his daughter's info being leaked, his career.
Exactly. His military career, finances, all in jeopardy. He admitted that in that stressed state, he was shooting everywhere, criticizing lots of people privately.
But he insisted these weren't, like, official statements.
No. Not formal accusations, not sworn testimony. The sources even highlight his frustration, his feeling that his actual account didn't quite match the story the investigators seemed to want.
Now, there's a part of this testimony the sources really zeroed in on. Moraes asked Cid if his own name, Moraes' name, came up in those alleged coup meetings.
Yeah, a very direct question.
And Cid's answer?
Also direct. Yes, Moraes was heavily criticized.
Okay, but then the nature of these criticisms, this is where it gets interesting, or maybe strange, according to the sources.
Right. Cid apparently described these discussions as very informal, like bar talk.
Over guaraná and salgadinho, soda, and snacks.
Exactly. He mentioned insults being thrown around, calling Moraes a damned guy, sharing memes, stickers, that kind of thing.
What? Crucially.
Cid explicitly denied, despite the harsh words, that there were any actual concrete plans to harm Moraes emerging from these chats.
This is where the commentary in the sources really highlights the power dynamic, isn't it?
Uh-huh. Cid's formal denial of coercion, made right in front of Moraes. The sources suggest you have to see that through the lens of self-preservation.
It's hard to take it at face value in that specific context.
That's the implication. And then there's the perceived absurdity, noted in the sources, of potentially taking these angry private vents, this bar talk,
and treating it as solid proof of a serious coup conspiracy.
Precisely. The suggestion is that these informal, frustrated conversations are being, quote, translated into a language the authorities want, reframed.
Turning frustration into criminal intent, potentially.
That's the concern raised. And this is where one source introduces a really unexpected viewpoint.
From Rui Pimenta of the far-left PCO party.
Yes. And the presenter in that source actually comments on the oddity of finding common ground there, saying something like, if we're agreeing with the PCO, things must be really bad.
Implying the situation is seen as extremely serious, crossing usual political divides. So what's Pimenta's argument?
His core point, as presented, is that the real coup isn't this specific plot Cid was asked about. He argues there's a much bigger, longer-term power play happening.
By whom?
By the Brazilian establishment, including the STF. He dates it back to around 2016. An ongoing effort to consolidate full state control.
And Bolsonaro's presidency, in this view, was just an interruption.
An unexpected interruption to that establishment project, yes.
Yeah.
And Lula's return, framed as something facilitated by that same establishment.
Wow. Pimenta calls the current system
an invisible dictatorship, heavily influenced by the STF. He labels this establishment group golpistas, coup plotters themselves, and warns they will do worse.
Okay, I see how these threads might connect now. You have the fear that regulation is about control.
From the first part, yes.
And then you have the intense scrutiny of private chats like Cid's bar talk, possibly being reframed as something more sinister.
Exactly. So, from the perspective offered by someone like Pimenta in the sources, this focus on one specific alleged coup plot based on informal talk.
It might be seen less as a genuine investigation.
And more as maybe a tactic or a symptom within that larger, quieter power struggle Pimenta describes, the invisible dictatorship trying to maintain control.
So controlling the narrative, how information is interpreted, becomes the real battleground.
That's the picture painted by connecting these different source perspectives.
This is quite a complex situation, but drawing on these sources, it really brings up fundamental issues that matter way beyond Brazil. They matter to you listening now.
Absolutely. It forces you to think about that global debate. Free speech versus online regulation. Who gets to draw the line?
And it highlights satire, doesn't it? How humor can be such a pertinent, if sometimes controversial, form of political critique.
And it really shows the complications of private talk in our super-connected, often scrutinized world. I mean, how do you navigate when venting might be treated as planning?
Yeah, it makes you question political narratives. How are they built? How hard is it to sift through different interpretations to find something like objective truth?
And ultimately, these sources make you confront basic questions about checks and balances, the separation of powers. When does interpreting the law become making the law?
So it's definitely a tangled web presented in these sources. We've seen the deep anxiety that regulation might just mean censorship. We've looked at Mauro Cid's testimony, the clash between his formal statements and his private desabafos, that bar talk.
And the way that informal chat is potentially being framed.
And then explored that provocative theory from Pimenta about a broader, ongoing, invisible dictatorship.
It's clear there are layers upon layers of perceived strategy, power dynamics, and contested meanings here.
So reflecting on all this material, here's a final thought for you to consider. In a world this polarized, this digitally saturated, how can we really tell the difference between someone just blowing off steam privately, someone actually planning something concrete, and maybe powerful interests strategically shaping narratives to maintain control? And maybe the biggest question, who gets to decide which is which? Who holds the key to the truth?